Started then. Thanks for being here today. We do want to talk about tough conversations. So just for your information, we just turned on the recording and I let you know that, and that's because the, Community Futures Highwood, who has sponsored this, they also like to share it within their team and other, partners and clients. And so that's great. And we are going to cover a fair amount of ground today, but I'll be the first one to admit that we may not get through it all. And that's because I think it's more effective rather than just grinding through a bunch of content to have as much dialogue and conversation as we can. So having said that, I don't want you to worry because I will drop the notes, the slides in the chat window. And then that means you can just, quite easily download them from there. And if you have a hard time with that, then you could drop your email address in the chat window and I'll make sure right after that we email them to you. So I don't want you to feel like if we don't get through everything, you won't have access to the information. But, I always like to start with this quote by Margaret Wheatley. And, it's one of the ones that really moved me when I started getting into the social services sector, seems like a long time ago now. And it was this idea of being brave enough to start a conversation that matters. And the first time I read it, I thought that the most important word there was brave. And that's a word that resonates with me. And so, of course, I thought it was most important. And I don't know, maybe it is the most important, but to me, the most important word there is the word conversation, because conversation, is different than shouting. Conversation is different than fighting for your rights. Conversation is different than making a statement. Conversation involves implicitly this idea that it's two-way, that perhaps you're listening as much or maybe even more than you're speaking, and that's brave because if I'm doing the speaking, I don't have to do the changing. I don't have to do the character adjustments, the communication adjustments. I don't have to learn any more social intelligence or even emotional intelligence. But the moment I decide to start listening, that's the moment of true bravery, because now I'm going to be hearing from somebody else. And what they say may stretch me, right? It may challenge me. It may move me out of my comfort zone. And I don't know about you, but we all have our comfort zones, and I sure do love to be comfortable. I mean, who doesn't? But at the end of the day, is that really the posture that we need to take when it comes to this thing called conversations? And one of the things that I bring to this table of sort of tough conversations is almost a sense of sacredness when it comes to conversations. And I don't mean this in a religious sense at all, but when we're having a conversation with people, that is holy ground, that is sacred space. And I think that if we have that mindset, it changes the dynamic, right? And why do I say that conversations are like holy ground or sacred ground? And again, not in a religious sense at all, but more in the sense of that there's something special about this when two people or three or four gather together, either in person or online, and now they're having conversation. And that's because everything significant in our lives, how many of you have noticed, comes through conversations, right? I mean, one skillful conversation can shift the direction completely. And I've seen this over and over again. And frankly, one unskillful conversation can also shift the direction completely, and often in a way that we don't want. And so, I just wanted to open up with that, and then sort of thought, is there any of you who'd be open to just sharing, some of your experiences with tough conversations, either good or bad, and it doesn't necessarily have to be through the lens of your experience. That would be nice, but it could also be what you've observed and what you've seen. So who'd like to just share what your experience has been with tough conversations?
Hi, Abe. I don't have a specific example in mind, but for me, I hate confrontation.
Mm.
And so I'm always trying to avoid it, but at the same time, looking for the opportunity in a tough conversation to move things forward. So I've tried to shift my mindset to say, I'm excited about having this conversation because of the potential it might bring to move ahead, to make things better.
I love that. And I appreciate your honesty, right? When you're sharing that you don't like confrontation. And I actually think there's something wrong if people do. Like, if somebody's walking around and they're like, I'm looking for the next, street fight here. There's just, they might not last too long. And so I appreciate your vulnerability because, I think that is shared by probably all of us. And I love what you said about looking for the opportunity in it. And that's just great. Keith, were you going to share?
Yeah, I think my training is to spend a lot of time kind of setting the tone or the stage for the conversation,
Right.
because if somebody becomes escalated, then it's not a learning opportunity,
Yeah.
and there probably won't be a good outcome. So I feel I do a pretty good job of that. The risk is that sometimes you can do so much of that that the message could be watered down to the point where you're not ending up with the result that you hoped for.
Yeah. So essentially, there's maybe the right atmosphere, but not a full sharing of each person's truth in the conversation. You're sort of saying, and that might mean that in the end, the outcome is a bit watered down. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly, right. And
Okay.
then you feel that you invested all that time, and that
Right.
at least it was partially wasted, or you're
Right.
going to have to do it again, which is a very bad result. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's actually great insight, Keith. Much appreciated. One or two more I'd love to hear from, and welcome, Ron. Nice to have you join us today. Anyone else like to share? Okay. Well, that's great. So, I mean, my experience with tough conversations is probably like yours in that I've had some good experiences. I've had some not so good experiences. I think that the fundamentals I probably learned actually way back in the day when I was working the night shift at the drop-in center, the Calgary Drop-in Center. And it's interesting because in the daytime, my day job was I was the Alberta regional manager for a chain of high-end audio and video and photography stores. And so I had, probably 200 employees that were working for me there and in 3 different locations across the province. And then about 1 or 2 nights a week, I would go work at the Calgary Drop-in Center on the front line. And because I loved it so much, I would always ask them to place me at the front door, which was also what they called at the time taking care of in-talks. And that's what they called it then. I'm not sure what they call it now, but as you can imagine, when you call a room with 200 people in it in-talks, it is literally the space where all of the folks who are intoxicated or under the influence would go. Because, if you've been to the DI, and I'm sure many of you have on tours or what have you, there's different floors, and each of those floors provide different programs and services. And, the other floors, many of them are working and need sleep. And so it's important to keep all of the folks who might not be sleeping due to, drug or alcohol use, or perhaps even some mental health issues, in a place where they're not disturbing those who are. And so there was every single shift. I mean, one confrontation or conflict after another, because some of you may have been to a bar on a Friday night back in the day when we were doing that. Remember pre-COVID those days? How many of you remember that? Like back in those days, right? You don't have to admit it. Because maybe you don't want to be seen as in a bar, and I'm certainly not a bar person, but I've been to a couple of them over the years, and probably once or twice I've seen conflicts break out. But when I was working at the drop-in center, I would see them like every night, over and over again. And part of our role as staff was to intervene. But if you had to intervene, at least I taught my team that was a failure. because the idea is to de-escalate before we get to the place where something needs intervention, right? Like if it's at a point, and you can't always control it, of course, but if it's at the point where people are fighting and you have to call security and the Calgary Police Service, what were the signs that you might have missed along the way? Because typically we don't go from 0 to 100 in a matter of 1 second. And one of the things that was so profound to me, and I saw this over and over again, I mean, so many times that it actually moved me, was that if you had two men, often who would have been intoxicated, who were how men will, go eye to eye, belly to belly, and it's almost like, who's going to make the first move. And then when you would introduce another man into that situation, try to de-escalate it, often both men would turn their anger on this new man who's trying to de-escalate it, because somehow they were feeling threatened by the presence of another male, or what they perceive to be somebody who might be, I don't know, a competitor to them or something. But so many times, maybe a smaller female would interject into the situation, and literally within minutes, we would see the whole thing de-escalate. And that tough conversation would move from being something that could have been physically violent to now an opportunity to actually have some sort of peaceful resolution, or at least enough to get people through the night, which was often the goal. And it taught me so much about the fact that how we engage in these tough conversations really matters. Like if there's one thing in life that our approach can make a difference, in my view, it is these tough conversations. And so, I thought I'd start by talking about a couple of conversation fails. Always better to start with maybe what's wrong versus what's right. I'm going to call it, the first one is the volcano. By the way, I've done all of these. And so this is, you could call this maybe the 20-second rule. If you just don't talk for 20 seconds, sometimes, how many of you know that conversation goes a whole lot better? And often when we react or respond in the moment, I think we've all found that has often a negative impact on how that conversation goes. I think the second fail is just the avoider. And this is a person who never gets in any conflicts, they never get in any confrontation, but they also aren't really solving issues. And they're not really leaning into, being a solution when they could be. And that's because they're just in a place where they're constantly avoiding. And I've done that. I mean, I personally have done that, where I've just said, I don't have the mental, emotional, almost spiritual energy today. And then today becomes tomorrow, and then tomorrow becomes next week. And, 2 years later, this thing has grown into something that had we had a conversation about it a while ago, it probably would not be, as difficult as it is today. The third, and I'm sure we've all seen this, is the bully. And this is, somebody who does not want any feedback, is somebody who does not want to have a two-way dialogue. They're convinced that they're about 99% right, about 99% of the time. And so no further discussion is required. And they're just going to bully you into a situation. I had the most, just last week, I had the most interesting encounter with somebody. I was a part of this in a business, and then I'm a part of a group of leaders, and I had given some feedback to somebody about something, and it was very respectful and very kind, and yet firm and to the point. And somebody else said, well, don't you think he'll be offended by the feedback that you've provided? And I was actually quite surprised by that comment, because it spoke to me about this idea that some people go through life not even looking for feedback. And my response was, any sort of business leader who is really interested in scaling their personal and professional growth has to be open to feedback, and especially when it's delivered with kindness and professionalism and respect, and maybe even when it's not, because sometimes you can actually not like the way the feedback is given, but you can actually still get value out of it. And so I thought that was interesting. And the complaints about this individual actually had been that they've been a bully, that they've never really been open to feedback, and every time they get it, that they tend to lash out. And that's quite interesting to me. I think another conversation fail would just be that awkward silence. And we've all been there, where, there's a fine line between having that awkward silence where we're pausing and reflecting and making sure that we're going to be strategic and intentional when we respond, and we're just basically caught in a moment, stuck in a moment that we can't get out of. The other one is the psychoanalyst, and how many of you have experienced this before, where you're trying to share maybe your heart or your side of a conversation, but the other person begins to psychoanalyze you and say, well, that's because, and now what happens is it's really not about the situation anymore. They've decided to make it about you. And I think that's always tragic. And I know many of you are in roles of responsibility, either in leadership roles in your organization or in management roles. And we can't ever make it about the person. We can make it about the behavior, or we can make it about the situation, but we can't ever fundamentally start psychoanalyzing somebody and trying to ascribe or understand, or assume we understand their motivation. I think that the next one that I would suggest is a problem sometimes is either too much logic or too much emotion. And what this kind of means is, there is in every conversation a logical element, right? Let's talk about the facts. Let's put them on the table. I also think that there's an emotional element in every conversation, so long as we're not having conversations with Siri. And sometimes even Siri can sound a little emotional. But, what we've got to try to find in tough conversations, I think, is the balance. Because most conversations aren't entirely about logic, and they're not entirely about emotion. They're often a nice blend of both. And I think that we do have to get to the head of the matter, so to speak, which is the logic, but we also need to get to the heart oftentimes to really understand what's behind this. And I think the last conversation fail that I'd like to share is just masks or armor. And, I'm sure we've all both experienced those things, either as, having on the mask and having on the armor, or in a conversation with somebody who has the mask on or the armor. I don't in any way want to paint that as, a cause for judging the other person. If somebody has a mask on, or if they're wearing armor, it doesn't take a psychologist to understand that the reason they're doing that is because they don't feel safe. Now, that lack of safety may not have anything to do with you. I mean, it might have something to do with you, but it may just be how they showed up that day. It may be what they've been experiencing. It may be how they feel about themselves in general. Maybe there's just a generalized lack of security and lack of validation and self-worth. And so, what would be wise, I think, in those tough conversations is to always ensure that we don't personalize the masks of others, and we don't, or the armor, and try to make it about us, but that we understand that all of us have our insecurities. And at a basic neurological level, neuroscientists tell us that we do tend to scan, our brain scans our social environment, if you can imagine, 5 times per second to ask this question, am I safe? And so there's this hardwired need that we have right into us at our biological core, where we need to belong, we need to feel a part of. And I think that a lot of tough conversations can put that at risk, right? I might lose my job. I might have a change in the relationship. I might have restricted access, so to speak. And so when people come into the conversation with masks and armor, one of the first things we need to do, I think, is we need to create safety. And I think that's kind of where I want to start this here today, because I think the primary sort of idea is, how do we create safety? Because if we create safety in a tough conversation, now what we're dealing with is bridges rather than walls. If I create safety, now what I have is an opportunity for shared dialogue and shared respect, and sort of that mutual back and forth that I think we would all agree is so important. But as long as even one person in the conversation doesn't feel safe, we're going to be dealing with walls and rather than bridges. And so, I just thought I'd ask this question. I think, and I like what you said, Keith, earlier, that you spend a lot of time trying to set the conversation up for success. And I'd love to just open it up and see what kind of role do leaders have, because we can talk all day long about tough conversations, and we will. I'll share a bit of a model in a few minutes about how I think we can walk through a tough conversation. But what's the role of leadership in an organization that can foster, an environment where tough conversations can happen without people going home, in tears every day? What do you think about that? And I'd love to just open it up and hear your thoughts.
Well, I think part of it is creating a culture where feedback is normalized. If not, ideally kind of welcomed, but at least normalized. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it. So feedback is normalized. Okay. That's great. Any other thoughts?
I was just going to say, Abe, I would probably add trust, like a culture of trust.
Okay.
I would agree with you, Keith, in that like that culture of feedback is wonderful, but I don't know that you can get to it, or it may be harder to get to it if there's no trust. So I think the role of leadership is to really inspire and to promote that trust, perhaps.
That's great.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking of, we talk about a safe space and creating a safe environment, but nowadays people talk about that nuance a little differently, and I cannot recall now how other ways people call it, because creating a safe space doesn't always exist because of how people can react to the feedback. So it kind of goes back to what Melissa said, trust. So that if you can be very open with the conversation, the person will not get their guard up, and then maybe become defensive. So, Abe, I don't know if you are more in tune with how, the safe space part is being changed in a different descriptive way. And that is important for the leader to ensure that that's occurring for open conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And we're actually going to get to a little bit of that concept of safety here, and actually what leaders need to do to create it, because I do think it is, there's sort of this idea where, I need to pay attention to my personal sense of safety and security, that's on me. But, if I'm, the most secure person on planet Earth, let's say, and I come into an environment that's not safe, then that is going to have a big impact on my ability to function. On the other hand, if you have a person who's not very, feeling safe just internally, just as a human, and they come into an environment that is safe, it's amazing how they begin to flourish, right? Because it's almost like they're being given permission to come out of that place of hiding almost, and they start to feel accepted and embraced and a part of the team. And now, then they actually, their personal security gets impacted. So it's almost like if I have personal security, but I'm in an unsafe environment, then it's going to be impacted. And if I don't have it and I come into a safe environment, it's also going to be impacted, right? So, and that's because, human beings are fundamentally, we're social creatures. That's why this lockdown and the idea of social distancing has been so devastating to people's mental health, irregardless of the physical health consideration with COVID. I think that the long-term mental health and physical health impact of this pandemic due to the social isolation is going to be profound. And we won't necessarily be able to measure that even for years to come. And that's just because, we are social animals, social beings, right? So one of the best quotes on leadership I've ever read when it comes to this idea of what's the role of the leader when it comes to creating safety, and I've used this over and over again, and it's, Von Goethe who said that I've come to the frightening conclusion, and this is sort of like older language, because this was, I believe, was in the late 1700s, but I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. I possess tremendous power to make life joyful or miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis is escalated or de-escalated, and a person is humanized or dehumanized. That's a bold statement, but according to the research, actually, it's actually true. When you look at the research and the psychological literature, you can actually see that leadership impacts psychological health of the employees. It impacts their physical health. So that's kind of crazy that I, as a leader, can impact the physical health of my employees. That's like scary responsibility, but it's true according to the research. And of course, and it makes sense that it would also impact occupational health and safety, because the level of stress that's in the workplace then impacts how I do my job. And people who are under tremendous stress, for example, they fall off ladders more than people who aren't, under tremendous stress. I mean, it's just all interconnected. And so you may have heard of a company called Google. How's that for an understatement? And by stock market value, they're in the top 5 in the world. But back in 2017, they decided to look at all of their teams, and they wanted to figure out who were their highest performing teams. And there was one quality that they found amongst all of their teams, and we're talking 70,000 employees all around the world. I think they're in 80 different countries now. And the one quality that was the most important in terms of high performance was psychological safety. And that just blows me away. They actually went into the study thinking that their highest performing teams would be the teams where the right people were on the bus. I mean, how many of you have heard that before, right? Management ethos. Just get the right people on the bus and point the bus in the right direction, and the bus will take care of itself, right? I mean, that's kind of what we hear. But what Google found out was it didn't matter who was on the bus, as long as the people on the bus felt safe. And if they felt safe psychologically, then they would perform as a high-performing team. Now, psychological safety, it's an interesting concept. What it actually means, and you can see it on the screen, is that it is a shared belief. Now, check this out, shared. Like if I feel safe, but you don't feel safe, then we don't have psychological safety, right? If belonging is going to work for one of us, it has to work for all of us, right? And so it's a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And this is really important because, we have gotten into, at least on social media, a bit of a naming and shaming sort of routine. And it's troubling to me because at a basic psychological level, when people don't feel safe, what do? Do they get better? Do they change their behavior? Of course not. When people don't feel safe, they end up reverting and getting even worse. And it's a tragedy. Kahn in 1990 said that psychological safety can be defined as being able to show and employ one's self without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career, right? So this stuff really matters. And what Google discovered is when they had this at play, it was amazing when they started to look at the business results of those teams where psychological safety was present. And so all of that leads me to this kind of conclusion, and that is this, that our goal, I think as leaders, is to create safety and to fight for that safety. That's like job number one, because if we have that, well, then everything else flows. And I think, it's pretty hard to argue with the results of Google. And so what we want to do is deal with bridges rather than walls, and psychological safety will allow us to do that. So, I just want to pause there for a moment and just see, if you have any thoughts before we dive into our next little segment. Just, even if you want to share a little bit of your own experience with psychological safety or the lack of it. Anyone at all?
I was just going to say from an organized, oh, sorry, somebody else?
No, go ahead, Keith.
Okay, thank you. From an organizational perspective, as far as learning and growing and connecting with new markets or demographics, staff need to be able to share things that didn't work or even mistakes that happened. And if they're fearful to do that, they won't learn and the organization won't learn either, right? So it's mutually beneficial to have that culture where people can take the risk of saying, I made a mistake.
Love it. So good, Keith. Thank you for that. And sharing feedback, sharing mistakes, sharing what's not working. Ron, how about yourself?
Well, I'm just going to add to that, saying that I've never really thought about it exactly this way before, but when I look back at different environments that I've been in, including my current environment, where I feel supported and I feel that, there is that opportunity for dialogue, I typically I do a lot better. Like I excel, versus in those environments where I'm just kind of, not supported or, not really encouraged to move forward. Those are the ones that typically I don't do as well in. So didn't really think about it being a kind of a basic human need, but I guess it probably does fall into that.
It does. Yeah, it's huge. It's huge, right? If you and if any of you are, who are on the call today are interested in diving into this, I mean, one of the best books I've read on it, and I've read lots on it, and Wellness Innovate, this is what we do in our business every day, and it's by Amy Edmondson, and it's called The Fearless Organization. Very recent publication, but she does an excellent job. Amy Edmondson, it's called The Fearless Organization. She does a great job of putting into quote unquote, layman's terms, the research that's out there. One of the things that she talks about, and she studied it in very, very important contexts like hospitals. And she found that when hospitals had psychological safety, they actually had more error reporting, right? And in a hospital, an error can lead to death, right? So it's different. Like on my job, errors, as far as I know, they don't lead to that. But of course, hospital, it's completely different. But what was happening is in psychologically safe hospitals, that error reporting was occurring. And then they were learning from those, and then the death rate or the mistake rate would go down, right? Interestingly, they also found on the opposite side, hospitals with very few errors being reported, really high death rates, unexplained death rates, and unexplained issues going on. And those would continue to increase. And so it's just for all the right reasons, we need to create safety, because then we can actually deal with the stuff, right? Every organization has the stuff that's holding them back, the elephant in the room, like whatever you want to call it, the practices, the processes, the ways of thinking, the culture, the behavior, whatever that's holding them back. And though it's tough to bring it up and it's tough to bring it out and it's tough to address it, when we do, the results are there. I think the question is how. So that's kind of what we want to now spend a few minutes on. And that's this idea that conflict, it is an opportunity. I mean, it is an opportunity. How many of you have seen that over and over again? I mean, this extends from maybe your marriage or primary relationships in your life to with your kids, to certainly in the professional space over and over again. I've seen that where a conflict starts and it's like, ooh, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but it actually becomes something that is an incredible opportunity. And I love what's on the screen there, that conflict is inevitable. How many of you would agree with that? But combat is optional, okay? So, we're gonna have conflict, but we don't have to have combat. And so how do we turn conflict into an opportunity? I think this is a fine art. And what I've done is taken the word connect and just broken it down into, I think, to 7 pretty simple principles that will help us move sort of from combat to conflict, right? That will help us move from sort of conflict to opportunity. The first principle, and this is number 1, is to choose conflict wisely. I just want to pause there. How many of you would just agree with that? There's a fine line between dealing with the right issues and having the bravery, the courage to speak, but also trying to take on everything. And also being sort of socially intelligent and aware of the right sort of timing, and I think this is really important. And so, you have to, if you're going to turn conflict into an opportunity, you got to choose them wisely. Look in the mirror, make sure that you're not choosing the conflict because of your own fears or insecurity, but also, don't show up every day looking to roll up your sleeves and go to battle, because that's not what it's about, And so I think we've got to really have this idea of choosing our conflicts wisely. I think the second thing is, once you've chosen that conflict and you get into the actual conflict itself, then O stands for open up about your feelings, thinking, and motivation. Now, that is almost an order for how the conversation should start. And let me give you an example of this. I mean, Connie and I, we work together, and we fight all the time. It's crazy, just joking. I don't know that we've ever really had any conflict. I mean, we've had certainly differences of opinion, and we resolve it like anyone else does. But let's just say Connie and I had a conflict. I mean, how would I open that up with her? Hi, Connie, I'm wondering if you have a couple of moments to talk about, and then I, one sentence, describe it. I'm feeling, and then I would fill that in, because if you start with feelings, that allows and invites a certain level of vulnerability on their part. I'm feeling, and then you fill in that blank. I'm feeling this way because I've been thinking, and then of course feelings lead to now a little bit of explanation of thinking, and then motivation. I'm thinking this because. And so if you notice, I find that a lot of the time in conflict, people start with their motivation. We need to solve this because, right? And already what's happening is you're leaning into a conflict almost with an offensive posture. Because, if I say, well, Connie, we need to solve this because, well, it's almost like in that statement, I'm thinking she doesn't know the because. Like somehow I'm seeing something she doesn't see, and how important this is to the organization, and how come I'm the only smart person in the room. And of course, that's going to elicit from her, not a bridge, but it's going to be what? A wall, because she doesn't feel safe. Whereas when somebody shares their feelings, not in a judgy, angry, but this just, I'm feeling left out. I'm feeling confused. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling a little upset. I think what it does is it already, you're starting with the worst, but in a way that's vulnerable. And then you move to thinking. I'm feeling this because I've been thinking. And then you move from there to the because, or the why, or the motivation. And I've always found that that's a really important framework. And it also gives you a chance to own your feelings. I'm not upset because of you, right? And I think in life coaching, that's one of the things we certainly say. And even back in the day when I was doing therapeutic work as a counselor on a regular basis, that no one else is responsible for how I feel. I have to own how I'm feeling. And, the moment I say, well, I'm feeling this because of what you did, then I'm putting it on you. You can't change my feelings. So I'm feeling this because I'm thinking that, not because you did this, right? And so then the person's posture is a lot more inviting dialogue from the other person. And we all know this, right? We all know that how we approach that, you can either invite dialogue or you're making a statement. And when you make a statement, you're not wanting to hear what the other person has to say. So that takes us then to the third thing, which is, I think, after opening up about your feelings, your thinking, your motivation, then this sort of nurtures a collaborative approach. So, I've just come to Connie and I've told her how I'm feeling, how I'm thinking, and what my motivation is. But then I'm done in the sense. And I say, so that's how I'm feeling. That's what I'm thinking. That's kind of what's driving me. But we're not going to get anywhere without hearing from you. So Connie, would you mind letting me know what you're feeling, what you're thinking, maybe what's driving you? And so, you've opened up the conversation, I think, in a way that's most likely healthy for everybody, but you've also, not only have you opened it up in a way that works for you, but it also works for the other person. So then that takes us to number 4, the fourth step, which is the second N, and now it's name the objectives. And so once, Connie's shared what she's feeling, thinking, and what's driving her, so then it's kind of like, okay, we need to solve this. Now, we're not going to solve everything in this conversation, but why don't we set a scope or a framework or a goal for what we think we can solve? I think, sometimes it's funny because there is some wisdom kind of in, sort of Sun Tzu, The Art of War. And that's, trying to take a big battle and, chunk it down into bite-sized pieces is often a really good strategy. Oftentimes people have a lot of emotion invested in a particular course of action. They have a lot of emotion and they have a lot of equity invested in a particular issue that may be triggering conflict. And so they may not be willing to give it all up or change it all today. But maybe what we do is we set an objective that says, okay, we can't solve this whole thing, but what can we solve? And I've discovered in these cases that it's a lot better to under-promise and over-deliver rather than it is to sort of over-promise, well, we're going to solve this, and then we're going to solve that, and then we're going to solve this. And everybody's like exhausted before we even get into the real sort of dialogue about the issues. And so, don't feel like it's a failure to not solve the entire conflict. If the conflict has 4 or 5 different issues, if you can get through 1 or 2 today, that's a win. I once heard it said, and I'll just repeat it. The best way to eat an elephant is 1 bite at a time. I'm not sure why you'd want to eat an elephant. Please don't. If you see any random elephants walking down the street, leave them alone. They seem pretty nice, gentle creatures to me. But nonetheless, if you were going to eat an elephant, then the way to do it would be 1 bite at a time. In other words, you just can't do it all at once. And I can't emphasize that enough. Learn how to think process. Learn how to treat the conflict almost like it's a project. And we're going to take 1 milestone down today, and maybe another tomorrow, and allow that process to unfold. So then that takes to number 5. So now when we're at number 4, this is now the serious negotiation stage. I mean, we're naming the objectives. We're talking about the issues. And I've always found that when you get to the issues and the objectives, it's so important to remind each other of your shared values. How many of you would agree with that, right? Like we both want the same thing here. Now, not the same objective, but we both want to operate. And then you might restate the organization's core values. You might want to restate, the big picture sort of organizational umbrella in terms of the big picture. Because, shared values are a powerful thing. We're all, as Canadians, I think, watching what's happening in the US right now with a mixture of shock and awe. How many of you know that, right? Where, you know, and in the US, it's so big, and their media is so pervasive, and it's all just on display. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, shared values, quote unquote, on both sides of the political aisle is the only way to bring them back together. And as long as, you know, I'm over here talking about my values and you're over there talking about yours, yeah, and that's fine. You can do that, and I can do this. But there's this middle ground where we can also co-inhabit and we can co-create. And yet, if I'm all siloed up over here and you're all siloed up over there, what do we got? We got nothing, right? We certainly don't have an opportunity in a conflict. The conflict just gets bigger and it gets worse, and it's a heartbreak because, you know, real people are getting hurt, right? It's not just theoretical. It's like genuine businesses are struggling and being destroyed, and real issues are going unaddressed. And so somebody always needs to, you know, sort of be, in one sense, you could say, the adult in the room, but not in an arrogant or adult kind of way, but just to remind, you know, hey, so like, what are our values here? What are the things that we want to really go back to as a shared framework? And this is, by the way, so powerful when you're doing performance evaluation, because, you know, values drive behavior, right? I mean, you don't have to tell me what your values are. I just have to watch you in action, and then I'll see what your values are. And performance management and performance reviews is really about measuring behavior and looking at, you know, how well somebody's behavior on the job is aligning to the corporate objectives. And so if the behavior is not aligning, it's almost always either a gap with respect to competency or values. And you know, the competency we can fix, right? We send them on a course, you know, give them the resources that are required so that they can learn the technical element of that job a little bit better. But the values is something that over time we want to ensure that folks have, and that only occurs through sort of two-way conversation. So that's number 5. Number 6, and I think this makes sense, is always sort of collaborate towards win-win. You know, and you know, win-win, you know, it's almost become a bit of a cliche, but you know what, it's just true that it's the best way to solve a conflict, right? And that's because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, if we don't have win-win, then what do you have? Well, you have win-lose. and that's not a great alternative either. And so I think what we've got to always think about is, how do we ensure that this conflict allows both people to walk out of it with their dignity, their status intact? I think that's important. And I think number 7 is really simple, and that's take tangible action, right? The conversation is going to keep repeating itself unless we now begin to take tangible action. Now, I just thought I'd just open up really quickly and see if any of you have any thoughts or comments or questions on that. And then I just want to spend another moment on this thing that we call the amygdala hijack. And then that's pretty much going to conclude us for the day. So any thoughts on this whole idea of turning conflict into an opportunity? Does it make sense? Tough conversation. Any thoughts on that? Heidi, we're going to mention something? No, okay. You're always looking at the little mute button, right? Okay. Excellent. Okay, so then let's just take a quick look at this amygdala thing. So many tough conversations are handcuffed by, you know, what you could call an amygdala hijack. And you know, an amygdala hijack refers to a personal emotional response that's immediate, overwhelming, and out of measure with the actual stimulus. How many have been a part of that before? Right? You're like, whoa, this was disproportionate. And maybe for you it was. And doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that oftentimes the other individual has experienced this amygdala hijack. And so this is important because if they are escalated, that's essentially an amygdala hijack, and then you get escalated, how many of you would agree that you're probably not going to have a happy ending, right? There's no rainbows or unicorns if we both have an amygdala hijack. And so somebody's got to stay out of the amygdala. And so again, I'm going to send these slides. There's a lot of text there, but the output of sense organs, and this is really important from a neuroscience perspective, so your sense organs, your eyes, your ears, even your smell, your taste, it's first received by the thalamus. Okay, so the part of your brain that gets that signal first, the things you see, the things you hear, is the thalamus. Now, part of the stimuli that the thalamus receives goes directly to the amygdala, right? So you don't have any filter. Things you see and hear, boom, goes right to that amygdala essentially. And the amygdala has been called the emotional or irrational brain. And then other parts of that stimulus is sent to the neocortex, and that's the thinking part, the rational part of the brain. If the amygdala perceives a threat too large, then the amygdala goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And then what ends up happening is literally they can see in brain scans blood flowing from the neocortex to the amygdala, right? So it's almost like the brain's capacity to be rational or to think is completely diminished in that moment. And because the emotional brain processes information milliseconds earlier than the rational brain, and this is really interesting to me anyways, the amygdala acts before any possible direction from the neocortex can be received. Okay, so it's like we're talking the speed of milliseconds, but the amygdala gets a little faster than the neocortex, which again is that rational part of you. And so now there's this threat response that gets triggered, and the person can act irrationally and destructively. And unfortunately, some people live that way. Like that they've been in it for so long. And there's almost this addictive state where the brain sort of lives there. It's like in this stew, this amygdala stew, and serotonin is a part of that. And they almost need that. And I think that that's a real challenge. And so the danger is that when we get locked into an amygdala hijack, our emotional memory lodged in the limbic center of our brain rules our actions without the benefit of logic or reason, which then causes this fight, flight, or freeze response. So if you've got 5 minutes for one more acrostic, it's only 2 today, Connie, so that's not too bad. Then I want to share what I call the chair model for tough conversations, okay? So how do you prevent the amygdala hijack? And I'm just going to give you 5 simple things. The first is C stands for calm. Okay, so, the Calm app is actually pretty good. Have any of you guys tried the Calm app before? It's a great app. You can check it out. Just search for it on the App Store. And it actually has meditation practices, mindfulness practices. It has music. It has images that can help you calm. I don't know about you, but I'm listening to music all the time. People come into my office, there's always music, and that is intentional. It's not just, I like music. I'm not a good dancer, so don't worry about that. You're never going to see me, shaking my hips to the tune. But I'll tell you what's happening is I'm letting the music speak to the parts of my brain that need to be in the neocortex, because that's where I want to stay all day long, just like you. We have to think strategically. We have to make big decisions. We have to create. We have to innovate. And so being calm is so important. So if you're in a state of calm, then when you end up in a place of stress or crisis, you're simply increasing your chances of being able to stay in that place of calm through it. How do you be calm? Well, we've talked about the Calm app. Obviously, in the moment, you can't necessarily say, give me 5 minutes, I got to go to the Calm app, but you can do deep breathing. And deep breathing is so important. That's why sort of the 20-25 second rule is so important before you respond. Secondly, is to script out tough conversations ahead of time. I've done this with clients time after time. Okay, you've got a tough conversation. Maybe you got to ask your boss for a raise. Maybe you got to have a hard performance review with an employee. and literally will actually word for word script the conversation out. Not so that they come into that conversation with a piece of paper and they're memorizing it, and not so that, but so that their brain has a track to run on. Having a track to run on for your brain is important, because then it means you're not going to get derailed into the amygdala. The second thing about tough conversations is honesty. I actually think that it's disrespectful to be dishonest. And so you might think you're just being Canadian, and that's polite. You know how Canadians, we don't really say what we think, and, we're kind of shy about it, and we always apologize and all of that. You might think that you're just being a Canadian, but in truth, you might actually be doing some harm, because there is something about honesty. And if you've ever read the book, Tough Conversations, and I encourage you to read it and master it and to listen to it over and over again, it's such a great resource. But one of the things they say is that there are two critical elements at the base of every successful tough conversation. Number one is respect, and number two is truth. Okay, so you've got to be respectful, but you've got to be honest. It's so important. The next part of this whole chair model is acknowledgement. And what does that mean? Always acknowledge the strengths of the other person. Always acknowledge the value that they bring. I just love the concept of, rather than trying to catch people do wrong, we're catching them do right. This need for acknowledgement, it's so profound. And all you have to do is look at social media for 5 minutes and see the profound lengths that people go to get acknowledgement, like the crazy stuff they post and the pictures of themselves and all kinds of things. And it's not because they're bad people or evil. It's just because we just so badly need to be acknowledged. And so in my tough conversations, I try to acknowledge ahead of time, right? But, let's just speak the good. Let's talk about what's great about the person. And that creates that safety environment, right? So that when the tough conversation happens, you're not now just trying to acknowledge them in the moment, but you also have this almost trust reservoir that's been built. And I know a couple of you commented on how important that is. And if you've created that before the tough conversation, now you've got a bit of a bank to draw on, a deposit that you can make a withdrawal on. So that's C, that's A, which is acknowledgement. The I stands for intense listening, and boy, I can't say enough about this, probably because it resonates with me. I'm painfully aware that I'm not a good listener. I'm working on it all the time. And, it's just an area for me. I've been working on it for years. And I think some people are just wonderful listeners. Doesn't it feel good when somebody listens to you, right? I mean, doesn't it feel good when you really feel heard? And so then that leads me to wonder, like, what does it mean to really hear someone? One thing's for sure is it means they're going to be nourished. It means they're going to be strengthened. It means they're going to feel like they belong. And I don't know, if this is a skill that we can ever stop working on. And then I think, last, and this is it, is just simply respond and resolve. I just don't think you can have a tough conversation without actually responding to what the person has said, and then resolving to really work hard and make sure that you resolve it. So I just want to finish with this. The chair model for tough conversations is calm, it's honesty, it's acknowledgement, it's intense listening, and then it's respond and resolve. So I'd love to just open it up for a moment and see if any of you have any comments or questions. And while we give you that opportunity, I'm just going to drop the slides from today into the chat window right now. And again, if somebody struggles with how do I download it from there, just send me a message here on this, a private message, and I'll get your email address, but it's in the chat window right now. And love to hear from anyone who is got a question or comment at all. Okay,
Abe,
well, yes, please go ahead.
Oh, Yeah, I was just going to mention something. I really like this chair model. Like these are really interesting kind of concepts along the way to consider. What are your thoughts around kind of authenticity and its role in this model? Like you could have someone, you know, speaking calmly to you, or vice versa. You know, you could have some, you know, what appears to be respect and truth, acknowledgement, but you know, what if that authenticity isn't coming through within the model? Like, is that something that you should be kind of aware of when you're using this model?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, for me anyways, that the honesty element under H would be the reflector with respect to authenticity, you know. And I do think authenticity is a really stronger word in some ways. So you could almost replace honesty with authenticity if you really wanted to, but then the acrostic is broken. No, I'm just joking, but you know, so yes, I agree with you 100%, Melissa, and you know, authenticity is so important, and I would say under honesty, that's essentially the same thing, because you really want to reflect what's happening. And when we were talking earlier about sharing, you know, feelings, thinking, motivation, I think that's a part of the authenticity that you're referring to. And it's so important, right? Because people need to understand both heart and mind.
These are great models, Abe. Like a lot of work would go on it. Like if you were thinking you were the supervisor kind of leading these conversations, to the point where it could get exhausting, or I'm just thinking about like looking after ourselves. And hopefully the person you're talking to would, to a certain degree, be a co-creator in creating this environment.
Yeah.
But what if they weren't, right? Like, is there a way to kind of bring them on board a little bit?
You know, that's such a great question, because, you know, years ago when I started in leadership, somebody had talked to me about this idea of managing across and managing down, you know, and managing up, rather than just managing down, because we're always thinking about leadership as managing down. You know, I've got to manage my team, but you know, this individual, you know, helped me to understand that so much of my success as a leader was going to be about managing across, and that would be influencing people who are my peers, and maybe even managing up, influencing the people who are my leaders. And so I think you raise a great point that we need to continually do that, you know, to have these types of conversations about this material outside of conflict, you know, so that when the conflict happens, you know, now we've got that framework, right? And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like marriage counseling. Like when, you know, I used to do marriage counseling, which is kind of strange, but you know, when you know, it's not just about what's happening in the conflict. It's what's happening outside of the conflict, because we bring into the conflict what's happening outside of the conflict, the atmosphere that's been created. So yours is a great point, and I think that's why, you know, leaders and teams who train, they are co-creating. And I don't just mean train in job function, but train in culture, train in communication, train in conflict. It makes such a big difference.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So any other comments or questions, or are we're good for today? Happy to entertain anything. Okay, well, thanks everybody so much, and grateful that you've all taken your time. Again, please do download the slides from the chat window, and if you haven't had a chance to do that, we'll give you a moment, and we will hopefully see you all again soon. Please stay safe and take care of yourself. Take care, everybody.